All right, value pillar. Everyone's favorite, talk about value, money. That's
Show
what we
me
get to
the
discuss.
money, as they say.
Yes. So this is a pillar that doesn't actually contain very many questions, but it contains some very critical questions. As we'd like to think, all of the questions are very important and critical. But this one, I think about my experience as a patient, there are some here that are very important to me because of the way that these downstream affect care. So the 3 questions in this category that we look at for all. This is we look at this for software as well as for services because this isn't specifically related to IT or software.
Right.
We ask a rating question about whether or not an engagement or a software is driving tangible outcomes, whether or not the client or customer received their money's worth, and then we ask a yes or no question about whether or not the vendor avoids if they avoid charging for every little thing. So nickel and diming, to use the U.S. terminology for that. We don't use that typically because I don't know that everybody in all other countries go, yes, nickel and diming, that phrase that we all use.
That's appropriate, yes.
So that's how that question sounds on the phone. We'll often talk using the phrase nickel and diming, but that's not how we ask it.
Yes.
So the first question about driving outcomes, that one's importance feels fairly self-explanatory. Is there some kind of a benefit? And the tangible piece of that becomes important. And one of the things that I will sometimes hear in my conversations with providers is when we ask about the outcomes and the value a system is driving, sometimes we will get responses that are, in my gut, I feel that there's some outcomes, but I couldn't exactly tell you what they are, or if I think they're in these areas, I can't measure their impact in any way. So one of the things that we see oftentimes strong performing vendors make mistakes with some of their customers is driving outcomes for them that they can't quantify so that the value isn't demonstrated. So I think about efficiency, especially staffing efficiency. It's very hot right now, a big topic. Quantifying the impact of staff efficiency can be very difficult to do in concrete ways, and being able to find ways to create dashboards or share case studies or different things to help a provider see what the value is and to inform them of the other types of outcomes that other organizations are achieving that they are not taking advantage of. Those are 2 things that are really critical in order to have a good customer experience here. And as a patient, great outcomes for the hospital and the doctor oftentimes will translate in some form or another to better care for me. So this is one of the ones that is a human, not just a KLAS employee, I find very valuable and important.
Something that's huge for me, so as a client success manager, one of our commandments is making sure that we understand what the goals are of our customer beforehand. You can have outcomes that you're like, well, we can show you this and this, but why did your customer partner with you in the first place? What does a measurable outcome look like to them? What are the goals that they need to quantify to be able to show that there's an ROI for this significant investment? And so for our vendors, you begin with an end in mind. Understand what the goals are. What does a measurable outcome look like to your customer? And it can vary.
It can vary, and it can also require you to meet them where they are in different ways. Population health is one software segment that we look at where one of the things that differentiates the top performers is their ability to manage that outcomes journey, knowing that the ultimate goal isn't this particular quality measure or this particular financial outcome by itself, but it's more encompassing than that. And so they're able to identify what are the checkpoints along the way. If you think about summiting Mount Everest, what are the base camps?
The Sherpa.
Yes.
Are you being a Sherpa?
How do we help you up that mountain? And that's where the pop health vendors and some, there are plenty in other segments as well, but that's one where we've seen some really truly stellar examples of the ability to know what the summit actually looks like, even if the provider themselves can't articulate that, so that you can meet them where they are and take them on that journey and be measuring and be successful with them along the way.
Yes.
This question is also very similar in some ways, although there are some very key differences to money's worth. So the outcomes, if there's a financial outcome there especially, you could say, well, that's money's worth, that's value. But money's worth, we think about that a little bit different than just driving outcomes. And it's also a little bit different than the next question we're going to talk about, the charging for every little thing. This is really the extent to which a provider feels that what they are putting into the solution is worth it for what they're getting out. So this isn't just about outcomes. It's not just about, is this a cheap, expensive product? It's also about how hard it is to maintain. If you put in an IV robot or a compounding robot into a pharmacy that is advertised as it's going to save you 5 FTEs, but you only have 2 in your department. I mean, that actually is not an outcome that is achievable. And in some cases, you may need to have more staff in order to support certain technologies. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, but because there is an investment of time, resources, dollars, staff, making sure that the outcomes or whatever else is coming out of that is something that is proportional. So we like to use the phrase the value equation a lot when it comes to money's worth, because you can be a very expensive solution and do very, very well with money's worth if you are making sure that the outputs outweigh the inputs.
Yep. And I'm going to sound like a broken record on this. Communication, especially in the sales process, really important. It's what is being sold, is the descriptions of the services or the consultation. Is that what you're going to end up getting? Mm-hmm. Is the investment that you made going to meet what you thought it was going to be?
Yes. One other thing to know about that is if you are stack ranking your questions as a software vendor or a service firm or whatever bucket you fall into, mm-hmm. It could be great on the one hand to go, money's worth is our top rated question. We're valuable. But because of the complexities you've mentioned there, if somebody is achieving really, really high money's worth in a segment that is very complex and nuanced and has a lot of challenges to overcome, that may not necessarily mean that it is a inherently valuable, amazing solution. It could be, but that oftentimes is a sign that it's a solution that is just so cheap that the value equation is really easy to come out ahead. So there are some really great solutions in very complex spaces that do have very high money's worth scores. But as a general rule, when we see this sort of being in the middle of the pack and mm-hmm. having some other questions about real value and outcomes and product strength or relationship strength ahead of money's worth, that is often a sign that there is something here that is more meaningful and sticky than just, this is a cheap solution. If you're competing on price, you're probably not going to be there long term. You're fairly disruptible.
Yeah, in some of our other conversations, you've talked about, you look at the individual scores, but strategically bundle them mm-hmm. together so that you can get a more holistic perspective. When you're looking at value, do these 3, talk about them and look at it that way. Mm-hmm. You're going to get a much more honest picture of where you stand.
Yes, so one thing to create a bundle there, the suggestion of looking at all 3 of these questions together is a really good way to look at the value. The other piece that I encourage vendors to do is also look at some of the other questions.
Absolutely.
One of the, I'd say the score profiles that we see in the data sometimes is, we would describe it as a widget, mm-hmm. Either because it is very point solution or it's because a provider isn't using it in a strategic way, where money's worth is oftentimes the highest or one of the highest questions, and one of the lowest questions is delivery of new technology. This is not to say that any solution out there is a toaster, but I think the toaster analogy works really well to illustrate why that is. I didn't pay a lot for my toaster. I don't expect there to be delivery of new technology there.
Does it make good toast?
It makes great toast.
That it's a good toaster.
But my air fryer has now replaced my toaster because it has lots of other features and functionality and value that it's providing to me. So if you have high money's worth, look to see where you stack rank your questions for delivery of new technology specifically, because those 2 things will often tell you, is it that you have just an inherently valuable solution that is priced maybe on the lower end, but is getting the scores and reception because of the strength of the product, or is it something that you don't charge very much and it doesn't take a lot to put into the system, which is often a sign that somebody else could probably come and take over your market there. So look at those 2 pieces together, in addition to the confluence of delivery of new technology, money's worth, and this final question in this pillar, which is avoiding charging for every little thing.
I love this question. I don't like to be charged for every little thing. Nobody does. And when I'm doing research, and when we're all doing, because we're all researchers at KLAS, this question brings up some really strong emotional feelings. Mm-hmm. Feelings of partnership, and when there is a sense of nickeling and diming, to use the phrase, mm-hmm. there's sometimes feelings of betrayal that come out in here. This is a hot button question, and people aren't afraid to answer it.
Oh no, they are not. They have feelings and opinions.
They do.
That said, if if I was in a vendor's shoes or a service firm's shoes and I was looking at where I wanted to drive improvement in an individual area, if you are scoring fairly well here, shooting for a perfect 100%, getting there is difficult to do if you're not focusing in other areas.
Yeah.
So one quick fix, but maybe not quick, but quicker, if you are very low performing here, so if you're getting 85% or fewer if you're a software vendor saying yes to this question, meaning 15% feel you are nickel and diming or charging for every little thing, or below about 88% if you're a services firm, that's when you really need to start looking at the way that you conduct the sales process and bundle the right things in for a provider to be successful. We generally find if there is 10% or so of folks that say they don't avoid charging for every little thing, that isn't necessarily damning. Look at the other questions in this pillar there and look at the outcomes questions, especially because that will tell you a lot about whether or not the solution is still valuable, even if the costs were unpredictable and frustrating. We find, we call it internally the Bermuda Triangle, our analysts, because it's, you need to have a low score here and some additional value problems in these other areas. And when all that is happening, when delivery of new technology isn't there, the outcomes aren't there, this piece isn't there, that's often the sign that there really is a nickel and diming or charging problem where you do really need to have an intervention. But I don't think that there's many things in my life where I have not been surprised by a cost. And that could be because all of a sudden a provider lost a lot of staff, and so they outsource some of what they were doing to another, or they extend their contract, or they change their goals and the types of things they're trying to accomplish, and so they need a different module. So some of those things a vendor and the service firm can do their best to try to make sure that they're creating a contract that is comprehensive and prescriptive, or that accounts for any potential out-of-scope work in a consulting engagement. And that's probably not a realistic goal to say we're always going to be prescriptive and we're never going to have anything out of scope. We're always going to deliver exactly what you need, because we get in and we learn a lot. So if you can achieve perfection here, excellent. But I would focus more, if I were in other companies' shoes, on the other two questions in this pillar as a means to drive this here, as well as thinking through if there are really big problems, that expectation setting and making sure to bundle the right things a provider needs to get success in the first place together during the sales process.
That is so critical. A common sand trap that people get into is, especially during the RFP process, they want to come in as the low bidder. And so they take things out like training. Well, you don't have to have training. If you want training, it's going to be extra. You don't need to do this. And by doing that, it's like selling a car without brakes. It's an analogy we use, but it's real. You want to be able to say, this is my price, and it includes these things. And the price is this because you need these things to be successful. You have to be prescriptive. And when that doesn't happen, when people come in and then they're like, I didn't have good ease of use, or I didn't have desired functionality. Well, what was training like? Well, we didn't do training because we had to pay for it. There's a ripple effect that goes on here.
Yeah. So including that training, not that you have to just eat the cost, but making sure that the cost of that is baked into the larger contract and that it's not negotiable. Right. The hard part about this question is, at the end of the day, you may need to walk away from a potential sale or engagement if you know that the provider is not going to be able to buy the pieces that they need to be successful. Yeah. That may not be the right fit because you have a vision and formula for success. It doesn't mean their way is wrong, but your path and their path to get there may not be aligned with each other. Yep. And there may be a better solution or service firm that's a better fit culturally or goal or structure wise. So that's a difficult one to do. Especially for small companies that are really trying to grow. And one of the concerns they have is, well, we need to grow, and if we say no to all these deals, how are we supposed to do that? We'll have no customers. So knowing that, yes, you need to have some customers, thinking very carefully about where your lines are going to be, what you are willing to cave on or not cave on. And then we see time and time again, there are large players that are well known for doing this, but those large players weren't always large. And we see in multiple different areas, some of the top performing, fastest growing vendors, their secret to success has been that they make sure that every client is going to be successful. And in some cases, I can think of a couple imaging instances that come immediately to mind where after saying no to that contract, years later, they ended up winning that business.
Not surprising.
Because it was clear that while the approach we did take was wrong, and said that doesn't always happen because there's more than one way to achieve success in any given market segment, but making sure that you are going to have very successful customers who are bought into your way of doing things so that you don't feel that you are fighting each other the whole way ensures that the communication is easier, the outcomes achievement is easier, and all the other pieces that we've been talking about.
Yeah. To use our Sherpa analogy that we talked about, you wouldn't want to lead your climbers over a crevasse and give them a 45-year-old broken extension ladder because it's less money. You want to make sure you're giving them what they can afford, but something that will get them safely to the next point in their journey.
Maybe they don't need the name brand hiking boots, but I feel like that ladder would be fairly important.
Crampons, want to put those on.
Yes, although I do have some very strong opinions on hiking boot brands, so maybe I'm not the best person to be having this conversation with.
And I'm not a person to be having the conversation with at all.
So that's the value piece there. So again, you can kind of sum all of this up as into, the provider are they getting what they need in the contract to be successful? Are they achieving the outcomes that they intended to achieve or solving the problem they hope to solve? And is the equation of inputs to output balanced? And that really sums up for both software and services this particular pillar.
Yes.